They expected chaos. They expected greed, noise, and sweat. They were told that capitalism was a machine that devoured men and spat out profit. But when the Soviet engineers finally walked through the gates of Detroit into the humming heart of America's industrial empire, what they saw was not chaos. It was choreography. Steel moved like clockwork. Engines assembled themselves through human rhythm and repetition. Thousands of men in identical overalls worked in silence, each one a small living gear in a colossal mechanical symphony. They had come to study an enemy. They found a mirror. They had come to expose the weakness of capitalism. They discovered its strength, efficiency. In the first decades of the 20th century, Detroit was not simply a city. It was an organism, alive, growing, fed by coal, oil, and ambition. The sky above the Rouge River never cleared. The air was a permanent dusk of smoke and steam. The horizon shimmered with heat from furnaces that burned day and night, and at the center of it all stood Henry Ford, a man who treated time as a material, as tangible as steel. To him, the factory was a cathedral, and productivity was prayer. His masterpiece, the Ford River Rouge Complex, was the most complete industrial facility the world had ever seen. Ore came in one end and cars rolled out the other, a miracle of total integration. Blast furnaces, rolling mills, glass plants, power stations, docks, and assembly halls, all connected by the endless hum of conveyor belts. At its peak, the Rouge employed over 80,000 men. Its furnaces consumed more coal in a week than some countries in a year. It had its own railroad, its own police force, its own port. And it ran on rhythm. A car left the assembly line every 93 seconds. Each worker performed a single motion hundreds of times a day, the same twist of the wrist, the same tightening of bolts. It was monotony elevated to art. The assembly line was Ford's revolution. He believed that specialization, reducing labor to precise, repeatable tasks, could liberate humanity from chaos. That if men learned to move like machines, machines would one day move for men. To him, industry was not cruelty, it was order. He once said, "The man who places the part need not know what the part is for." Critics called it dehumanization. Ford called it civilization. For the American worker, the Rouge was a strange mix of heaven and hell. It offered steady pay, but demanded absolute obedience to the clock. It gave dignity through work and erased individuality in the same breath. But outside its walls, the nation adored it. In a decade defined by uncertainty, stock market crashes, unemployment, dust storms, the Ford factory was proof that America could still bend chaos into rhythm. Newspapers wrote of it with reverence. Visitors described it as a kingdom of motion. To the common man, it was the promise that technology could conquer disorder, that modernity could be built bolt by bolt. And somewhere far away, another empire was listening. By the late 1920s, the Soviet Union was a nation out of breath, born from revolution, scarred by civil war, and ruled by ideology that promised utopia but inherited famine. The Bolsheviks had taken power with words, but words could not plow fields or smelt steel. The country's villages were medieval, its factories were ruins. Then came Joseph Stalin. He declared that the Soviet Union had 10 years to catch up with the West or be crushed. To him, industry was not economics, it was survival. The first 5-year plan was announced in 1928. It was not a plan. It was a declaration of war against poverty, against time itself. Millions of peasants were herded into collective farms. Resources were stripped from the countryside and poured into concrete and iron. Every poster screamed the same message: build, produce, accelerate. But how do you accelerate without knowing the machine? The Soviet engineers could design ambition, not precision. Their blueprints were drawn on paper that tore in their hands, their tools dulled after days of use. They needed guidance, not from ideology, but from those who had already built the future. And so the unthinkable began. The Soviet Union turned to Henry Ford, the capitalist prophet himself. In 1929, a delegation arrived in Dearborn, Michigan, led by Soviet trade officials and engineers. Their goal was simple: to buy a piece of the American miracle. Negotiations took months. The Americans wanted gold. The Soviets wanted factories. Eventually, a contract was signed. Ford Motor Company agreed to provide blueprints, machinery, and technical advisors for a new automobile plant in the Soviet city of Nizhny Novgorod, later renamed Gorky. The deal was worth $30 million, paid partly in gold and partly through raw materials, manganese, asbestos, and timber. Ford would send engineers to the USSR. The Soviets would send students to Detroit. Each side thought it was using the other. Ford saw a new market for his methods. Stalin saw a shortcut through history. Neither understood what they were unleashing. When the first Soviet engineers arrived at the Rouge plant, they expected decadence. They had been told that capitalism meant chaos, drunken workers, waste, and greed. Instead, they found silence. Order, a choreography of motion so exact that it seemed mechanical. They watched steel pour like liquid sunlight into molds that hissed and steamed. They watched stamping presses the size of houses fold metal sheets into the shape of doors and fenders, each movement timed to the beat of a whistle. They saw thousands of men, black and white, moving in sync without command, their gestures guided not by politics but by precision. It was like entering a different century. One Soviet engineer later wrote, "We thought the machine served the man." Here the man served the machine willingly, almost proudly. They took notes obsessively, conveyor speeds, tool angles, lighting arrangements, even the spacing between lunch breaks. They photographed everything, but what lingered in their minds was not the machinery, it was the rhythm. Efficiency, they realized, was not just a system, it was a culture. When the delegates returned home, they carried more than documents. They carried a revelation. Factories, they told the Politburo, could be built like orchestras, each part knowing its cue. But to do that, the Soviet worker would need to become something new, disciplined, obedient, mechanical. Stalin listened. He understood. And he ordered the construction of an entire city around that idea. On the banks of the Volga, in the snowbound emptiness of central Russia, work began on the Gorky automobile plant, the Gaze. It would be the largest automobile factory in Europe. Its purpose to mass-produce vehicles for the Red Army, for the state farms, for the future, and to build it, the Soviets hired Albert Kahn Associates, the American architectural firm that had designed Ford's Rouge plant itself. Soon over 300 American engineers crossed the Atlantic, bringing with them drawings, machines, and habits. They stepped onto Russian soil and found chaos. No roads, no cranes, no foundations, just frost, mud, and determination. And they began to build. The Gorky automobile plant was never meant to be just a factory. It was designed to be a manifesto, cast in concrete and steel, an entire civilization built around motion. When construction began in 1930, the Volga banks were nothing but frozen soil and scattered wooden huts. There were no roads wide enough for American cranes, no housing for the thousands of workers who would soon arrive. The wind from the river cut through every layer of clothing. The ground froze solid by October. Yet somehow the blueprints demanded progress. 1,000 foundations by spring, walls by summer, assembly halls by autumn. The first American specialist from Albert Kahn's firm stood bewildered. In Detroit, they had built factories on level ground with predictable schedules and trained crews. Here, they worked beside peasants who had never seen a wrench before, and still they built with rope, timber, and desperation. Each shipment from the United States arrived with a mix of awe and suspicion. Massive steel presses, diesel generators, electrical panels, stamping tools, all wrapped in crates stamped Ford Motor Company, Dearborn. For many Soviet workers, those words were the first English they ever read. They assembled machines by candlelight. They mixed concrete with shovels, heated with coal fires dug into the snow. They worked 20-hour days, sometimes sleeping on the floor beside unfinished walls. A few of the Americans left within months, driven away by cold, by bureaucracy, or by the unending surveillance of Soviet security officers. But others stayed, fascinated by the audacity of it all, the idea of building a world from nothing. One of them, a foreman named George Snyder, later wrote, "They were poor, hungry, and determined. I saw men work with hands bleeding through their gloves, laughing because they believed the world was watching. And the world was watching." Progress in the Soviet Union was measured not in comfort, but in output. The 5-year plan demanded miracles: build faster, work harder, exceed quotas. Posters declared, 5 years in 4. Reality replied, or die trying. The state imposed impossible production goals. Supervisors falsified numbers. Machines broke. Men collapsed. And yet the whistles never stopped. Labor camps provided volunteers for construction. Entire brigades of prisoners, engineers, peasants, soldiers, were marched to industrial sites under armed guard. Some worked until they froze. Others vanished into the snow. But the statistics kept rising. By 1935, Soviet industrial output had more than doubled. Steel production surpassed Britain's. Electricity generation increased sixfold. From Moscow's point of view, the plan was working. Factories were rising, trains were running, tractors rolled into collective farms. The country was awakening from centuries of stagnation by sheer force of will. Yet beneath the triumph was a quiet truth. Much of this progress had been copied. The Soviets didn't invent the assembly line. They imported it and adapted it to discipline. Where Ford had sought harmony, Stalin found control. In America, the conveyor synchronized labor. In the USSR, it synchronized obedience. The similarities between Dearborn and Gorky were uncanny. Both cities lived by the rhythm of the whistle. Both worshipped efficiency. Both believed in the redemptive power of work. But their moral foundations could not have been more different. In America, Ford saw the factory as a social experiment, a way to unite workers through steady labor and fair pay. He even founded schools, orchestras, and housing programs for his employees. In Stalin's Russia, the factory was an instrument of ideology. To build meant to serve the party. To fail meant betrayal. Engineers were celebrated one day, imprisoned the next. Sabotage was defined not by intent, but by inefficiency. If a machine broke, someone would be blamed. Still the rhythm continued, relentless, mechanical, holy. A worker from the gas plant later recalled, when the siren sounded, it was like church bells. We stopped thinking, we just moved. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet press called workers soldiers of production. Factories were their battlefields. Output was victory. And though the slogans were different, the feeling was the same as in Detroit, men bound by motion. Henry Ford never visited the Soviet Union, but he followed its progress closely. When asked by a reporter about his cooperation with the communists, he said simply, "They are learning to make things. That is all that matters." For him, ideology was irrelevant compared to productivity. For Stalin, productivity justified ideology. They were opposites, and yet, somehow twins, both believed that salvation could be engineered. Both replaced faith with efficiency. Both built systems that measured virtue in output. Ford dreamed of machines that freed men from toil. Stalin built machines that turned men into tools. And yet, for a moment in history, their visions met, and the world changed forever. The war machine. When the 1940s arrived, the dream of progress turned to war. The same factories that once produced cars began to forge weapons. In America, the Rouge plant became part of the arsenal of democracy, producing engines for bombers and trucks for the Allied front. In the Soviet Union, the Gaz plant switched to building military vehicles, the Gaz MM truck, the BA-64 armored car, and later the T-60 light tank. Bombers destroyed the plant repeatedly. In 1943 alone, over 25,000 bombs fell on Gorky. Still, production resumed within days. The assembly lines born from Ford's blueprints were rebuilt in underground tunnels. Every bolt tightened there echoed across continents, the rhythm of industrial endurance. By 1945, the same machines that Ford had sold to the Soviets 15 years earlier were producing the trucks that drove into Berlin. The irony was complete. The tools of capitalism had become the weapons of communism, but the machine did not care who commanded it. It served only motion. After the war, both nations stood victorious and exhausted. The United States emerged rich and confident, its factories untouched. The Soviet Union emerged scarred, half its cities in ruins, but its industrial base unbroken. The world entered a new conflict, the Cold War, built not on ideology, but on production. Steel versus steel, output versus output. Both superpowers believed they were defending freedom, but both were serving the same silent master, efficiency. In the decades that followed, the Gorky plant continued to grow. It built trucks, cars, buses, and armored vehicles, millions of them. By the 1970s, it was one of the largest factories on Earth, and still, in its foundations, the ghosts of Ford's machines remained. Some of the original American presses were still in use 50 years later, still humming the same mechanical hymn. Workers joked that even if the party fell, the machines would keep running because they no longer needed orders. They were self-propelling monuments to human obsession. By the late 20th century, the rhythm had spread beyond metal and smoke. Factories evolved into offices, conveyor belts became networks. The hum of engines turned into the buzz of electricity. Yet the principle remained unchanged: repetition, precision, and control. In 1930, men imitated machines. In 2030, machines imitate men. The same faith persists that progress is inevitable, that perfection lies just beyond the next algorithm, the next line of code. But every cycle carries the same question the Soviet engineers once whispered in Detroit. If the machine never stops, what becomes of the man who feeds it? They came to America expecting to witness the decay of capitalism. Instead, they saw its masterpiece, the art of movement made holy. They returned home with stolen blueprints and awakened hearts. They built factories, cities, and faith in the power of precision. But in doing so, they proved a truth deeper than ideology. Progress has no flag. No nation owns it. It moves wherever hands and minds surrender to its rhythm. The machine does not care whether the hammer bears a star or an eagle. It only asks to be kept in motion, because motion is meaning. And once mankind learned to measure itself by speed, there was no turning back. They thought they were learning how to build the future. They did not realize they were surrendering to it.